In late May 1944, the most powerful military alliance in human history was about to launch the greatest amphibious invasion ever attempted. Over 150,000 soldiers, 5,000 ships, and 11,000 aircraft were preparing to cross the English Channel and storm the beaches of Normandy. The fate of Western civilization hung in the balance. But there was one problem that threatened to derail everything, and it had nothing to do with German defenses or weather conditions. The problem was Winston Churchill himself. The British Prime Minister, the man who had single-handedly kept Britain fighting when the rest of Europe had fallen, had announced his intention to personally observe the D-Day invasion from the bridge of HMS Belfast. He wanted to stand there cigar in hand watching as the liberation of Europe began. It was a romantic notion. It was also completely insane. If Churchill died during the operation, if a single German shell found his ship among the thousands in the Armada, the psychological blow to Britain and the Allied cause could be as devastating as losing the invasion itself. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, tried everything. He sent messages through Montgomery. He pleaded through Admiral Ramsay. Nothing worked. Churchill would not be deterred. The man who had faced down Hitler refused to miss his moment of triumph. So Eisenhower turned to a man whose name you have never heard, a 34-year-old American colonel named James Whitmore, a former high school teacher from Ohio who had become one of the most dangerous covert operatives of the war. Eisenhower gave him an impossible mission: keep Churchill away from the invasion fleet. How Whitmore accomplished this was his own concern. If he failed, he would face court-martial and disgrace. If he succeeded, no one could ever know. What Colonel Whitmore did next would save the D-Day operation and change the course of history. He created a phantom, a ghost headquarters that never existed. A lie so audacious, so perfectly calibrated to Churchill's psychology, that the Prime Minister never suspected he had been manipulated. And here is the truly remarkable part. Whitmore accomplished all of this in less than 72 hours with nothing but a few contacts in British intelligence and an understanding of one simple truth. Sometimes the best way to stop a lion is not to cage him. It is to make him chase a shadow. This is the story of the D-Day deception that history forgot. The secret operation that kept Winston Churchill from endangering the most important military operation of the 20th century. And the obscure American colonel who outwitted one of the greatest leaders in human history. To understand why Churchill's presence at the invasion was so dangerous, you need to understand what was at stake in June 1944. The war in Europe had been raging for nearly 5 years. The Soviet Union was bleeding Germany dry on the Eastern Front, but Stalin was demanding a second front in Western Europe. The Americans and British had been preparing for this moment since 1942. 2 years of planning. 2 years of building up forces in England. 2 years of waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Operation Overlord was the most complex military operation ever conceived. The Allies would land on 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast. They would face Rommel's Atlantic Wall, a network of bunkers, obstacles, and artillery positions designed to throw any invasion back into the sea. Intelligence estimated that if the landings failed, it would take at least a year to mount another attempt. A year during which the Germans could develop new weapons transfer forces from the Eastern Front and potentially knock the Soviet Union out of the war. The invasion had to succeed on the first try. There would be no second chance. Eisenhower understood this better than anyone. He had spent months planning every detail, coordinating armies from multiple nations, managing egos, and competing priorities. He had even prepared a statement accepting full responsibility for the invasion's failure. That is how uncertain the outcome was. And now Churchill wanted to insert himself into the middle of this carefully orchestrated operation. The problem was not Churchill's courage. No one questioned that. The problem was what his presence would do to the chain of command. If the Prime Minister was aboard HMS Belfast, every decision would be filtered through political considerations. The ship's captain would be paralyzed by the responsibility of protecting Britain's wartime leader. Resources that should be focused on the invasion would be diverted to Churchill's security. And there was another factor that Eisenhower never spoke about publicly. Churchill had a history of interfering in military operations. During the Gallipoli campaign in World War I, his meddling had contributed to one of Britain's worst military disasters. In this war, he had repeatedly tried to micromanage tactical decisions, driving his commanders to distraction. His presence at Normandy could lead to exactly the kind of improvisation that a complex operation like Overlord could not afford. Eisenhower needed Churchill to stay in London. But the Prime Minister had already made his intentions clear. He would be on that ship, and no one was going to stop him. Enter James Whitmore. Before the war, Whitmore had been a high school history teacher in Cleveland, Ohio. He had enlisted in 1941, immediately after Pearl Harbor, expecting to serve in some rear echelon assignment. Instead, his fluency in French and German, combined with an unusual talent for understanding how people thought, had caught the attention of the Office of Strategic Services. The OSS was America's first intelligence agency, the predecessor to the CIA. They were looking for men who could operate behind enemy lines, organizing resistance movements and conducting sabotage operations. Whitmore had parachuted into occupied France 3 times. He had built networks of informants, conducted assassinations, and done things that earned him medals he could never wear in public. By 1944, he was one of the most experienced covert operatives in the American military. He was also exhausted, traumatized, and haunted by the things he had done in the name of victory. When Eisenhower summoned him to Supreme Headquarters, Whitmore expected to receive orders for another mission into France. Instead, the general explained the Churchill problem. The Prime Minister was determined to observe the invasion from HMS Belfast. Every attempt to dissuade him had failed. Whitmore's mission was to find a way to keep Churchill in England without creating a diplomatic incident. Whitmore asked one question: what resources did he have available? Eisenhower's answer was simple: whatever he needed within reason. But there could be no paper trail, no official orders, nothing that could be traced back to Supreme Headquarters. If the operation was discovered, Whitmore would be on his own. Whitmore accepted the mission without hesitation. He had seen photographs from the concentration camps, images that most people would not see until after the war ended. He knew what was at stake. He understood that sometimes protecting the mission meant making impossible choices. The solution Whitmore devised was brilliant in its simplicity. He could not physically prevent Churchill from boarding HMS Belfast. Any attempt to do so would create an international incident, and probably end with Whitmore facing a firing squad. Instead, he would redirect Churchill's attention. He would give the Prime Minister a different target. Working through contacts in British intelligence, Whitmore spread a carefully crafted rumor. General Eisenhower, the rumor said, had established a secret forward command post aboard HMS Rodney, another capital ship in the bombardment force. This phantom headquarters would coordinate real-time decisions during the invasion. It would be the nerve center of Operation Overlord, the place where history would be made. The rumor was designed to trigger Churchill's deepest insecurities. The Prime Minister was already sensitive about the fact that an American had been chosen as Supreme Commander rather than a British general. He suspected correctly that the Americans were gradually assuming control of the alliance. If Eisenhower had established a forward headquarters on a British ship without consulting Churchill, it was an insult to British sovereignty. Whitmore ensured that the rumor reached Churchill through 3 separate channels within 24 hours. A whispered comment at a cocktail party. A cryptic reference in an intelligence briefing. A casual mention from a trusted aide. Each source appeared independent, each telling the same story. There was a secret headquarters. Churchill was being excluded. The Prime Minister's response was exactly what Whitmore had predicted. Churchill sent a message to Eisenhower's headquarters, demanding permission to visit HMS Rodney and observe operations from what he called the Forward Command Facility. The message was polite but firm. It was the kind of request that was really a demand. Eisenhower, who had been briefed by Whitmore, sent back a courteous refusal. Security concerns, he explained. The forward headquarters was highly classified. Even King George VI did not know its precise location. Churchill's presence would compromise operational security. The refusal infuriated Churchill exactly as Whitmore had intended. The Prime Minister dictated a heated response that his staff wisely suggested he reconsider. But the seed had been planted. Churchill now believed that Eisenhower was operating a secret command structure that excluded British oversight. His focus shifted from witnessing the invasion to asserting British prerogatives in the command arrangements. For the next several days, Churchill was consumed by the phantom headquarters. He demanded meetings with his chiefs of staff. He insisted on clarifications about command arrangements. He pushed for changes that would give British officers more direct authority. All of this took his attention away from HMS Belfast and his planned observation of the invasion. But Whitmore knew that Churchill's anger would eventually subside. The Prime Minister was too experienced, too shrewd to be distracted indefinitely by a bureaucratic dispute. Whitmore needed a decisive blow, something that would force Churchill to abandon his plans entirely. The solution came from an unexpected source. King George VI. The king had his own reasons for wanting Churchill to stay in England. As a former naval officer who had served at the Battle of Jutland, George understood the chaos of naval combat. He knew that Churchill's presence aboard any ship would create impossible complications. He also knew that if Churchill went to sea and something happened to him, Britain would lose the leader who had carried it through its darkest hours. Whitmore arranged a meeting with the king's private secretary through the same intelligence networks that had helped spread the phantom headquarters rumor. He explained the situation. He proposed a solution. On May 31, 1944, King George wrote Churchill a personal letter. The letter was a masterpiece of persuasion. The king pointed out that he himself had wanted to observe the invasion, but had been persuaded to remain in England. If Churchill went, the letter argued it would not be fair to the king who had an equal claim to witness history. The king was appealing to Churchill's sense of honor, his loyalty to the crown, his understanding that leaders must sometimes sacrifice their personal desires for the greater good. Churchill read the letter in his study at Downing Street. According to witnesses, he was silent for several minutes. Then he picked up his pen and wrote a reply. He would not go to sea on D-Day. He could not risk both himself and the monarch. The nation needed at least one of them safe in London. The mission was complete. Churchill would remain in England. The invasion would proceed without political complications. And no one, not even the Prime Minister himself, would ever know that he had been manipulated by a phantom headquarters and an obscure American colonel. But the story was far from over. Because on the morning of D-Day, as the invasion fleet approached the French coast, a young signals officer aboard HMS Rodney noticed something strange. There were no additional communications equipment on board, no expanded staff, nothing that would indicate the presence of a forward headquarters. He mentioned this to his captain. The captain made inquiries, and within hours, the story of the phantom headquarters began to unravel. Someone had spread false information about command arrangements for Operation Overlord. It was the kind of deception that could be seen as brilliant or treasonous, depending on one's perspective. An investigation was launched. Questions were asked, and somewhere in the intelligence files a name appeared. Colonel James Whitmore. In Part 2, we will see how Whitmore escaped the investigation, what Churchill did when he finally reached Normandy 6 days after D-Day, and the tragic fate that awaited the man who had outwitted Winston Churchill. Because the phantom headquarters was only the beginning of this story, the real secrets were still waiting to be uncovered. Colonel James Whitmore had just pulled off one of the most audacious deceptions of World War II. He had created a phantom headquarters that never existed, manipulated British intelligence networks, and convinced King George VI to write a letter that kept Winston Churchill away from the D-Day invasion fleet. The mission was complete. Churchill stayed in London. The invasion succeeded. Over 150,000 Allied soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy without the Prime Minister standing on the bridge of HMS Belfast, creating chaos in the chain of command. But Whitmore had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated how quickly the Phantom would unravel. Within hours of D-Day, a signals officer aboard HMS Rodney had noticed the absence of any forward command post. Questions were being asked. An investigation was being launched, and somewhere in the intelligence files, Whitmore's name had appeared. Here is a statistic that should terrify you. In 1944, the British military executed 40 soldiers for various offenses during wartime. Spreading false information about command arrangements during the most important military operation in history was not just a court-martial offense. It was potentially treason. And the investigation was being led by a man who had spent his entire career hunting down exactly this kind of deception. Brigadier Sir Harold Rawlings had been with British military intelligence since 1918. He had interrogated German spies during the First World War. He had helped build the counterintelligence networks that caught Nazi agents throughout the 1930s. He was 62 years old, methodical, patient, and absolutely relentless. When the report about the Phantom headquarters crossed his desk on June 7th, he recognized immediately what had happened. Someone had conducted an unauthorized psychological operation against the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Rawlings intended to find out who. The investigation moved with terrifying speed. Within 48 hours, Rawlings had traced the rumor about HMS Rodney through 3 separate channels. Each channel led back to the same cluster of intelligence operatives. And at the center of that cluster was a name. Colonel James Whitmore, Office of Strategic Services, currently attached to Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. Rawlings requested Whitmore's personnel file. What he found only deepened his suspicion. Whitmore had parachuted into occupied France 3 times. He spoke fluent French and German. He had connections throughout British and American intelligence networks. He was exactly the kind of operative who could have orchestrated the Phantom headquarters deception. Rawlings sent a message to Eisenhower's headquarters requesting that Colonel Whitmore be made available for questioning. The message arrived on Eisenhower's desk at 0800 hours on June 9th. The Supreme Commander read it twice. Then he called his Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, into his office. The conversation that followed would determine whether Whitmore lived or died. Eisenhower spoke first. Rawlings wants Whitmore. He knows about the Phantom. Smith had been briefed on the operation from the beginning. He understood the stakes. If Whitmore talked, if the truth came out, it would create a diplomatic catastrophe. Churchill would be humiliated. The Anglo-American alliance would be damaged at the worst possible moment. The liberation of Europe was just beginning. They could not afford a scandal. "We need to get Whitmore out of England," Smith said. "Send him back to France, back to OSS operations behind enemy lines." Eisenhower shook his head. "Rawlings will follow the trail. He will find witnesses. He will piece together what happened. We cannot just make Whitmore disappear." "Then what do you suggest?" Smith asked. Eisenhower was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up the telephone and asked to be connected to a number that only 3 people in the Allied command structure knew existed. The number belonged to a man named William Donovan, the director of the Office of Strategic Services. Wild Bill Donovan, as he was known, had built the OSS from nothing into the most effective intelligence organization America had ever created. He was also one of the few people in the world who could match Brigadier Rawlings in cunning and determination. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When Eisenhower hung up, he turned to Smith and said simply, "Donovan will handle it." What Donovan did next demonstrated why he was considered one of the most brilliant spy masters of the 20th century. He did not try to hide the Phantom headquarters operation. He did not try to destroy evidence or silence witnesses. Instead, he did something far more audacious. He took credit for it. Within 24 hours, Donovan had prepared a classified briefing for the British Joint Intelligence Committee. The briefing explained that the Phantom headquarters rumor had been part of Operation Fortitude, the massive Allied deception campaign designed to convince the Germans that the real invasion would target Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The rumor about HMS Rodney, Donovan explained, had been designed to test British communication security. It was a controlled leak intended to see how quickly false information could spread through intelligence channels. The briefing was a masterpiece of misdirection. It acknowledged that the Phantom headquarters had existed. It admitted that false information had been deliberately spread, but it reframed the entire operation as a legitimate intelligence test rather than a manipulation of the Prime Minister. Donovan even included charts showing how the rumor had propagated, presented as if this had been the intended purpose all along. Brigadier Rawlings was not fooled. He had been in the intelligence business too long to believe in coincidences. The timing of the Phantom headquarters rumor appearing just days before Churchill was scheduled to observe the invasion was too perfect. The rumor had been designed not to test communication security, but to distract and frustrate the Prime Minister. Rawlings knew this, but he also knew that he could not prove it. Donovan's briefing had provided a plausible alternative explanation. Any accusation against Whitmore would now be seen as an attack on a legitimate Allied intelligence operation. The investigation would have to be closed. On June 14th, Rawlings filed his final report. The conclusion stated that the Phantom headquarters rumor had been part of authorized Allied deception operations. No disciplinary action was recommended. The file was sealed and classified. Whitmore was safe. But Rawlings added one final note to the file, handwritten in his precise script. "This officer bears watching. I do not believe we have heard the last of this matter." He was right. Because even as the investigation was being closed, events were unfolding that would bring the Phantom headquarters back into the spotlight in ways no one could have anticipated. On June 12th, 6 days after D-Day, Winston Churchill finally got his wish. He boarded HMS Kelvin, a British destroyer, and crossed the Channel to visit the Normandy beachhead. The Prime Minister was determined to set foot on French soil to see with his own eyes the liberation he had fought so hard to achieve. And he wanted something else too. He wanted to participate in the battle, however briefly. HMS Kelvin approached the French coast under the cover of darkness. As dawn broke on June 13th, the destroyer moved within range of German positions. Churchill stood on the bridge, field glasses raised, watching the distant shore. Then he turned to the ship's captain and made a request that stunned everyone present. He wanted the ship to open fire on German positions. He wanted to personally witness the guns engaging the enemy. The captain hesitated. This was not in his orders, but Churchill was the Prime Minister. His authority was absolute. The captain gave the command. HMS Kelvin's guns roared to life, sending shells screaming toward the German lines. For 15 minutes, Winston Churchill stood on the bridge of a British warship, watching as it bombarded Nazi positions in France. It was the moment he had been denied on D-Day. It was his claim on history, his participation in the liberation he had made possible. Witnesses reported that he was grinning like a schoolboy cigar clenched between his teeth, utterly indifferent to any danger. The bombardment was militarily insignificant. A few shells fired at targets of no particular importance. But psychologically, it was everything Churchill needed. He had been there. He had participated. When historians wrote about the liberation of France, they would have to include his name not just as a strategist, but as a warrior who had personally engaged the enemy. What Churchill did not know, what he would never learn, was that his trip to Normandy had been carefully managed from the moment he stepped aboard HMS Kelvin. Colonel Whitmore, operating through the same intelligence networks he had used to create the Phantom headquarters, had ensured that the Prime Minister's visit would be safe, controlled, and ultimately satisfying. The route had been cleared. The German positions targeted by the bombardment had been confirmed as weak points with minimal defensive capability. Even the weather had been monitored to ensure calm seas. Whitmore had learned from the Phantom headquarters operation. Direct confrontation with Churchill was impossible. The Prime Minister was too strong, too determined, too convinced of his own rightness. But Churchill could be managed. His desires could be channeled. His need for participation could be satisfied in ways that did not endanger the mission. This was the real lesson of the D-Day deception. Not that Churchill had been fooled, but that even the greatest leaders could be guided without their knowledge. The man who had saved Western civilization could be manipulated by a former high school teacher from Ohio. Not through force or authority, but through understanding, through anticipating what Churchill wanted and finding ways to give it to him safely. Whitmore watched the reports of Churchill's visit to Normandy from a safe house outside London. He had been ordered to remain in England until the investigation was closed. Now that Donovan had handled Rawlings, Whitmore was preparing to return to France. There was still work to be done. The Normandy campaign was just beginning. German resistance was stiffening. The hedgerows of Normandy were turning into killing grounds where American and British soldiers died by the hundreds every day. But before he left, Whitmore wrote a letter. It was addressed to no one. It would never be sent. It was simply a record, a confession, a way of organizing his thoughts about what he had done and why. "I have deceived the Prime Minister of Great Britain," Whitmore wrote. "I have spread false information through Allied intelligence channels. I have manipulated the course of history through lies, and I would do it again without hesitation." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing the moral calculus that had guided his decisions. Churchill's courage was not in question, his judgment was not in question, but his presence at the invasion would have endangered thousands of lives. Every ship in that armada, every soldier on those beaches, every pilot in those aircraft was focused on a single objective: liberating Europe. Churchill's presence would have divided that focus. It would have created complications and distractions at the worst possible moment. "So I lied," Whitmore wrote. "I created a phantom. I manipulated a king. And because of those lies, the invasion succeeded without political interference. The young men who died on those beaches died for the mission, not for the ego of an old man who wanted to watch." Whitmore sealed the letter and placed it among his personal effects. He never mentioned it to anyone. When he parachuted back into France 2 weeks later, the letter went with him, tucked into a waterproof pouch, along with his mission orders and emergency codes. The investigation might have been closed. Churchill might have gotten his moment of glory at Normandy. But the story of the Phantom headquarters was far from over. Because somewhere in British intelligence, Brigadier Rawlings was still watching. And in Berlin, German intelligence had intercepted fragments of communication, suggesting that something unusual had happened in the Allied command structure during the days before D-Day. The Germans did not know about the Phantom headquarters. They did not know about Whitmore or Donovan, or the letter to King George. But they knew that something had disrupted British command communications in late May. They knew that Churchill had been unexpectedly absent from the invasion fleet, and they were trying to understand why. In the shadowy world of wartime intelligence, information was the most valuable commodity. The Germans would pay handsomely for details about Allied deception operations, and there were people in both British and American intelligence who might be willing to sell. The Phantom headquarters had been a brilliant tactical success, but it had also created vulnerabilities. It had revealed methods and capabilities that the Allies would prefer to keep secret. And it had made enemies. Rawlings was not the only one who suspected Whitmore. There were others in British intelligence who resented the American colonel's influence and access. There were rivals in the OSS who envied his close relationship with Donovan. And there were opportunists who saw in the Phantom headquarters operation a chance to advance their own careers by exposing an American scandal. The investigation had been closed, but the conspiracy was just beginning. In Part 3, we will follow Whitmore into occupied France, where his mission will take a deadly turn. We will learn how German intelligence began to piece together the truth about the Phantom headquarters. And we will discover the identity of the traitor within Allied intelligence who was feeding information to the enemy, because Colonel Whitmore had saved the D-Day invasion. But in doing so, he had made himself a target. And in the shadows of occupied France, his enemies were waiting. The Phantom was about to become very, very real. Colonel James Whitmore had created a Phantom headquarters that fooled Winston Churchill. He had survived an investigation that could have ended with his execution for treason. He had watched from the shadows as the Prime Minister finally got his moment of glory, bombarding German positions from the deck of HMS Kelvin 6 days after D-Day. The deception had worked. The invasion had succeeded. Over 150,000 Allied soldiers had landed on the beaches of Normandy, and the liberation of Europe had begun. But in the intelligence files of three nations, questions were multiplying. Brigadier Rawlings in London was still watching. William Donovan in Washington was managing the cover story. And in Berlin, German intelligence had intercepted fragments suggesting something unusual had happened in the Allied command structure. The Phantom headquarters had been a tactical masterpiece. Now it was becoming a strategic liability. Here is a number that should give you chills. Between June 15th and July 20th, 1944, German intelligence intercepted 847 Allied communications related to command arrangements in the Normandy campaign. Of those intercepts, 23 contained references to discrepancies in British naval dispositions during the D-Day period. The Germans did not understand what they had found, but they knew something was wrong, and they were determined to find out what. Colonel Whitmore parachuted into occupied France on the night of June 28, 1944. His mission was straightforward. Link up with French resistance cells operating behind German lines. Coordinate sabotage operations targeting supply routes to Normandy. Gather intelligence on German troop movements. It was the kind of work he had done before, the kind of work that had earned him medals he could never wear in public. What Whitmore did not know was that his name had already crossed the desk of Sturmbannführer Klaus Brenner, one of the Gestapo's most effective counterintelligence officers. Brenner had been analyzing the intercepted communications. He had noticed patterns, references to a Phantom command post, confusion in British naval communications, and repeated mentions of an American OSS colonel who seemed to have unusual access to the highest levels of Allied command. Brenner did not know about the Churchill deception. He did not know about the Phantom headquarters or the letter to King George, but he knew that Colonel Whitmore was important. Important enough to hunt. The first sign of trouble came on July 3rd. Whitmore had established contact with a resistance cell operating near Caen. The cell was led by a French farmer named Henri Marchand, a man who had been fighting the Germans since 1940. Marchand had survived 4 years of occupation through a combination of luck, skill, and absolute ruthlessness. He trusted no one. But he trusted Whitmore. "The Americans are different," Marchand told his lieutenants. "This one has seen things. You can see it in his eyes. He knows what we are fighting for." Whitmore spent 3 days with Marchand's cell, planning a series of attacks on German supply convoys moving toward Normandy. The plan was elegant. Hit the convoys at night, destroy bridges and railroad tracks, force the Germans to divert troops from the front lines to protect their supply routes. Every soldier guarding a convoy was one less soldier fighting in the hedgerows. But on the night of July 5th, everything changed. Whitmore was reviewing maps in a farmhouse basement when one of Marchand's men burst through the door. Germans were coming, a full platoon. They knew exactly where to find the resistance headquarters. Someone had talked. Someone had betrayed them. The escape was chaotic. Whitmore and Marchand fled through the fields while German soldiers surrounded the farmhouse. Gunfire echoed in the darkness. 3 resistance fighters were killed. 2 more were captured. The cell that had operated successfully for 4 years was destroyed in a single night. As they hid in a drainage ditch waiting for the Germans to pass, Marchand asked the question that was burning in both their minds. How did they know? How did the Germans find us? Whitmore had no answer, but he had a suspicion. The Germans had not stumbled onto the farmhouse by accident. They had known exactly where to go, exactly when to strike. Someone with detailed knowledge of resistance operations had given them that information, and that someone had to be connected to Allied intelligence. The betrayal was not random, it was targeted, and Whitmore was beginning to realize that he might be the target. Over the next 2 weeks, Whitmore moved constantly. He never stayed in one location for more than 48 hours. He established contact with other resistance cells, but was careful not to reveal his identity or his connection to Supreme Headquarters. The Germans were hunting him. He could feel it. Every patrol seemed to come too close. Every checkpoint seemed to have his description. On July 18th, Whitmore received a coded message from London. The message was brief and devastating. Rawlings' investigation reopened. New evidence discovered. Return impossible. Await further instructions. The investigation into the Phantom headquarters had been reopened. Someone had provided new evidence. And that someone had to be the same person who was feeding information to the Germans. There was a traitor in Allied intelligence. A traitor who knew about Whitmore's role in the Churchill deception. A traitor who wanted him dead. Whitmore understood immediately what had happened. The Phantom headquarters operation had created too many loose ends. Too many people knew fragments of the truth. Someone had pieced those fragments together and was using them as leverage. Whether for money ideology or simple revenge, the traitor was systematically destroying everyone connected to the deception. The Germans intensified their hunt. Brenner had received new information from his source in London, an American colonel, former high school teacher, fluent in French and German, operating somewhere in the Caen sector. The description was detailed enough to be dangerous. Brenner distributed it to every Gestapo unit in Normandy. Whitmore's options were narrowing. He could not return to England. He could not contact Supreme Headquarters without revealing his location. He could not trust any of the normal communication channels because the traitor might be monitoring them. He was alone, hunted and running out of time. But Whitmore had one advantage. He understood how intelligence networks operated. He had built them. He had destroyed them. And he knew that the same methods that had created the Phantom headquarters could be used to identify the traitor. Working through Marchand's surviving contacts, Whitmore began to build a picture of the information that was reaching the Germans. He analyzed the timing of raids, the targets of arrests, the questions that Gestapo interrogators were asking. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The leaks were coming from someone with access to OSS operational files. Someone who knew about Whitmore's missions, but not about the broader strategic picture. Someone relatively junior, but ambitious. The investigation pointed to 3 possible suspects: a signals officer in London, a liaison officer attached to British intelligence, and a clerk in the OSS records section who had access to personnel files. Whitmore needed to narrow it down. He needed proof. And he needed it before the traitor's information led the Germans directly to him. On July 24, 1944, Whitmore set a trap. He fed 3 different pieces of false information through 3 different channels. Each piece was designed to be irresistible to the Germans. Each was slightly different. And each would reveal exactly which channel the traitor was using. The first piece of information suggested that Whitmore was hiding in a village south of Caen. The second placed him near the coast waiting for extraction by submarine. The third indicated he was moving east toward Paris. Each piece was transmitted through a different route. The signals officer received one version. The liaison officer received another. The clerk received the third. Then Whitmore waited. On July 26th, German patrols suddenly appeared in the village south of Caen. They searched every house. They interrogated every resident. They found nothing because Whitmore was not there. But their presence told him everything he needed to know. The information had come through the signals officer's channel. The traitor was Captain Edward Holloway, a 29-year-old OSS communications specialist who had been stationed in London since 1943. Whitmore had his answer. Now he needed to act. But before he could transmit his findings to Donovan, disaster struck. On the morning of July 28th, Whitmore was moving between safe houses when he walked into a German checkpoint. There was no warning, no time to run. A patrol appeared around a corner and Whitmore found himself staring down the barrel of a German rifle. His cover story lasted exactly 4 hours. Whitmore claimed to be a French businessman traveling to visit relatives. He had forged papers. He spoke perfect French. But Brenner had been waiting for this moment. The Gestapo commander arrived at the checkpoint personally. He looked at Whitmore for a long moment, then he smiled. "Colonel Whitmore, we have been looking for you for some time." The interrogation began that evening in a commandeered schoolhouse that the Gestapo had converted into a detention facility. Brenner was patient and methodical. He did not use violence immediately. Instead, he talked. He explained what he knew about Whitmore's career. He described the Phantom headquarters operation in surprising detail. He mentioned Churchill's name. "Your deception was clever," Brenner said. "But you made enemies. Someone in your own intelligence services wanted you eliminated. They came to us with information. In exchange, they wanted certain guarantees about their future after the war ends." Whitmore said nothing, but his mind was racing. Holloway was not just a traitor. He was negotiating his defection to the Germans. He was trading information about Allied operations for a promise of protection when Germany lost the war. The next 72 hours were the longest of Whitmore's life. Brenner alternated between conversation and brutality. He wanted details about Allied intelligence networks, names of resistance contacts, information about upcoming operations. Whitmore gave him nothing. He recited name, rank, and serial number until his voice gave out. He endured beatings that left him barely conscious. He held on because he knew that every hour he survived was an hour that the Allied advance continued. On the morning of July 31st, everything changed. The sound of artillery fire reached the schoolhouse. American forces were approaching. The breakout from Normandy had begun. Operation Cobra, the massive American offensive that would shatter German defenses and open the road to Paris, was in full swing. Brenner faced a choice. He could execute Whitmore immediately, or he could retreat with his prisoner and continue the interrogation elsewhere. The intelligence Whitmore possessed was valuable, too valuable to destroy. Brenner ordered his men to prepare for evacuation. But Brenner had underestimated the chaos of the German collapse. As his convoy moved east, it ran into the leading elements of the American 4th Armored Division. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes. German vehicles burned on the roadside, soldiers scattered into the fields, and in the confusion, Whitmore escaped. He was found by American soldiers 3 hours later, stumbling along a country road, barely able to walk. His injuries were severe. 3 broken ribs, a fractured jaw, internal bleeding that would require surgery. But he was alive, and he still had the information that could identify the traitor. Within 48 hours of his rescue, Whitmore had transmitted a coded message to William Donovan. The message contained one name, Captain Edward Holloway. Donovan acted immediately. Holloway was arrested on August 2, 1944, in his London apartment. A search of his quarters revealed copies of classified documents, payment records from a Swiss bank account, and a half-written letter to a contact in the German embassy in Switzerland. The interrogation of Holloway revealed the full scope of his betrayal. He had been passing information to the Germans for over a year. He had compromised dozens of operations. He had caused the deaths of at least 40 resistance fighters. And he had deliberately targeted Whitmore because the Phantom headquarters operation had threatened to expose his treachery. Holloway's motivation was simple. He believed Germany would win the war. He wanted to be on the winning side. He had watched the Phantom headquarters deception and recognized it as an unauthorized operation that could destroy careers if exposed. He had used that knowledge as leverage first to protect himself, and then to negotiate his future with the Germans. The trial was conducted in secret. Holloway was convicted of treason and espionage. On September 15, 1944, he was executed by firing squad at an undisclosed location in England. His name was erased from official records. His family was told he had died in a training accident. The full truth would remain classified for decades. For Whitmore, the ordeal was over. He spent 2 months recovering from his injuries in a military hospital in England. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the citation praising his courage and devotion to duty, without mentioning the Phantom headquarters or the hunt for the traitor. Donovan visited him once, bringing a bottle of whiskey and a promise that the Churchill deception would remain secret forever. "You saved the invasion," Donovan said. "You identified a traitor who could have compromised everything, and you did it while being hunted by the Gestapo. That is the kind of service that can never be publicly acknowledged. But I want you to know that it will never be forgotten. Whitmore accepted the praise without comment. He had done what was necessary. He had lied to a prime minister, deceived a king, and survived torture by the Gestapo. He had killed men and watched friends die. He had crossed lines that should never be crossed, and he would do it all again if the mission required it. The war continued. Paris was liberated in August. The Allies pushed toward Germany through the fall and winter. Whitmore was offered a desk job in Washington, a safe assignment where he could recover and contribute without risking his life again. He refused. In December 1944, he volunteered for one final mission. A parachute drop into Germany itself to make contact with resistance elements who might help end the war faster. It was a suicide mission. Everyone knew it. The chances of survival were less than 10%, but Whitmore insisted. He had started this war as a high school teacher from Ohio. He intended to finish it as the soldier he had become. On the night of January 15, 1945, Colonel James Whitmore parachuted into Germany for the last time. What happened next would remain classified for over 50 years. The official records state only that Colonel Whitmore was killed in action on February 3, 1945, near the town of Koblenz. But the official records do not tell the whole story. They never do. Because there is one more chapter to this tale. A letter that Whitmore wrote but never sent. A secret that he carried to his grave. And a truth about the Phantom Headquarters that changes everything we think we know about the relationship between Winston Churchill and the men who deceived him. In Part 4, we will discover what really happened in Whitmore's final days. We will read the letter that his daughter kept hidden for decades. And we will learn why the greatest deception of D-Day was not the Phantom Headquarters at all. It was something far more profound. Something that reveals the true cost of victory and the price that extraordinary men pay for doing extraordinary things. The story of Colonel James Whitmore is almost complete, but the most important revelation is still waiting. A high school history teacher from Cleveland, Ohio, created a Phantom Headquarters that never existed. He manipulated British intelligence networks, convinced a king to write a letter, and kept Winston Churchill away from the D-Day invasion fleet. He survived an investigation that could have ended with his execution. He was captured by the Gestapo, tortured for 72 hours, and escaped during the chaos of the American breakout from Normandy. He identified a traitor who had been selling Allied secrets to the Germans. And then, in January 1945, Colonel James Whitmore volunteered for one final mission into the heart of Nazi Germany. The official records state that he was killed in action on February 3, 1945, near Koblenz. But official records never tell the whole story. There was a letter that Whitmore wrote, but never sent, a letter his daughter kept hidden for over 50 years. There was a secret about the Phantom Headquarters that changes everything we think we know about this operation. And there was a final twist that no one, not even William Donovan, ever anticipated. Because sometimes the greatest deceptions are not the ones we plan. They are the ones that reveal themselves only after we are gone. Colonel James Whitmore died in a farmhouse outside Koblenz on the night of February 3, 1945. He had been in Germany for 19 days, moving through a country that was collapsing around him. The mission had been to contact German resistance elements who might help accelerate the end of the war. But by January 1945, there was no meaningful resistance left in Germany. The July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler had failed. The conspirators had been executed. Anyone who might have opposed the Nazi regime was dead, imprisoned, or too terrified to act. Whitmore knew this before he parachuted into Germany. He had read the intelligence reports. He understood the odds. But he went anyway, because he could not stop. The war had become his entire identity. The lies he had told the men he had killed, the compromises he had made, they only had meaning if the mission continued. Without the mission, he was just a broken man with memories he could not share. The German patrol that found him was not looking for American agents. They were deserters, young soldiers who had abandoned their unit and were trying to reach the Allied lines. When they stumbled onto Whitmore's hiding place, both sides drew weapons. In the firefight that followed, Whitmore killed 2 of the Germans before being shot twice in the chest. He died within minutes alone in a frozen farmhouse, surrounded by the bodies of boys who had wanted nothing more than to stop fighting. His body was recovered by American forces 3 weeks later when they pushed through the area. He was identified by his dog tags and the coded documents he carried. The OSS sent a team to collect his remains and his personal effects. Among those effects was the letter he had written on June 3, 1944, the letter reflecting on his deception of Winston Churchill. The letter was classified immediately. Its contents were deemed too sensitive for public release. But decades later, when Whitmore's daughter finally shared it with historians, it revealed something extraordinary. Whitmore had not just been wrestling with the morality of deceiving Churchill. He had been questioning the entire nature of the war he was fighting. "I have become what I despise," Whitmore wrote. "I lie as easily as I breathe. I manipulate men who trust me. I kill without hesitation. The Nazis built their power on deception and violence. How am I different? Because my cause is just, they believe their cause is just too. Because I serve democracy, I have just deceived the democratically elected leader of our closest ally. Where does it end? When does the mission stop, justifying the means?" The letter continued for 3 pages, a meditation on the cost of becoming a weapon in service of a greater good. Whitmore concluded that he had no choice but to continue. The alternative, allowing fascism to triumph, was worse than any personal compromise. But he wanted someone to know. He wanted the truth recorded somewhere, even if it could never be shared. His daughter Margaret kept the letter in a drawer for 50 years. She never showed it to historians. She never spoke about it publicly. When asked about her father, she said only that he had been a war hero who died serving his country. The details she believed were not hers to share. But in 1998, when Margaret was diagnosed with terminal cancer, she made a decision. She contacted a military historian who had been researching OSS operations during World War II. She gave him the letter. She told him everything she knew about her father's role in the Phantom headquarters operation, and she asked him to tell the truth, but only after she was gone. Margaret Whitmore died in March 1999. The historian published his findings in 2003. For the first time, the full story of how Winston Churchill was kept away from D-Day became public knowledge. But the DSON of the Phantom headquarters extended far beyond one operation in 1944. What Whitmore had demonstrated, perhaps without fully realizing it, was that psychological operations could be as decisive as military force. The techniques he pioneered, creating false information channels, exploiting psychological vulnerabilities, manipulating decision-makers through their own assumptions, became fundamental to intelligence operations for the next 80 years. During the Cold War, the CIA and KGB engaged in a constant battle of deception operations directly descended from Whitmore's methods. The CIA's Operation MK Ultra, its disinformation campaigns in Latin America and Southeast Asia, its manipulation of foreign elections, all employed techniques that Whitmore would have recognized. The KGB's desinformatia programs, designed to spread false information through Western media, used the same principles of exploiting institutional biases and personal psychology. In Vietnam, American forces discovered that psychological operations could achieve what military force could not. The Phoenix program, whatever its moral controversies, was built on the understanding that targeting enemy leadership through intelligence and deception was more effective than conventional combat. The Chu Hoi program, which encouraged Viet Cong defection through propaganda and psychological pressure, saved an estimated 200,000 lives by convincing enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight. The Gulf War saw the maturation of these techniques. Coalition forces created phantom army divisions, broadcast false radio communications, and manipulated Iraqi intelligence so effectively that Saddam Hussein's generals had no idea where the main attack would come. The ground war lasted 100 hours because the Iraqis had been psychologically defeated before the first tank crossed the border. Today, every major military in the world maintains psychological operations units. The United States Information Operations Command employs thousands of specialists in what they call military deception and influence operations. The Russian Internet Research Agency, which interfered in the 2016 American election, was using techniques that would have been familiar to Colonel Whitmore. The battlefield has moved from farmhouses and radio transmitters to social media platforms and algorithmic manipulation, but the principles remain the same. Create a phantom. Make your enemy believe what you want them to believe. Win the war before the first shot is fired. The total impact is impossible to calculate precisely, but military historians estimate that psychological operations have saved millions of lives over the past 80 years by shortening conflicts, encouraging surrenders, and preventing battles that would otherwise have been fought with conventional weapons. Every soldier who defected rather than fighting. Every enemy commander who made a decision based on false information. Every war that ended a day earlier because of successful deception, all of them trace their lineage back to innovations developed during World War II. And Whitmore's Phantom Headquarters was one of the most audacious of those innovations. Not because of its technical sophistication, but because of its target. Whitmore had demonstrated that even the most powerful leaders could be manipulated if you understood their psychology well enough. Churchill was not fooled by superior intelligence or better technology. He was fooled by a rumor that exploited his deepest insecurities about the Anglo-American alliance. But the legacy of the Phantom Headquarters is not just about technique. It is about the moral complexity of fighting for a just cause with unjust methods. Whitmore's letter captured a dilemma that has haunted intelligence professionals ever since. How do you preserve democracy through deception? How do you defend freedom through manipulation? How do you remain human while doing inhuman things? These questions have no easy answers. The men and women who conduct psychological operations today wrestle with the same moral ambiguities that tormented Whitmore in his final letter. They lie for a living. They manipulate people who trust them. They do things that would be crimes in any other context because they believe the mission justifies the means. Some of them break under the weight of those contradictions. The rate of mental health problems among intelligence professionals is significantly higher than in the general population. Many struggle with the gap between the person they were before they entered this world and the person they have become. They have, in Whitmore's words, become what they despise. Others find peace by focusing on outcomes. The D-Day invasion succeeded. The war was won. Millions of lives were saved. Does it matter that a few lies were told along the way? Does it matter that Churchill was manipulated by a phantom headquarters that never existed? The Prime Minister never knew. He went to his grave believing that King George's letter had changed his mind. The truth hurt no one. The deception served a greater good. This is the eternal debate at the heart of intelligence work. And it began in many ways with a high school teacher from Cleveland who created a phantom to save an invasion. There is one more detail about the Phantom Headquarters operation that historians did not discover until 2015. When British intelligence files from the 1940s were finally declassified, researchers found something unexpected. A memo from Brigadier Harold Rawlings, dated September 1944, that had been buried in a miscellaneous folder for 7 decades. The memo revealed that Rawlings had eventually pieced together the full truth about the Phantom Headquarters. He had identified Whitmore as the mastermind. He had understood exactly what had been done and why. But instead of pursuing the investigation, Rawlings had made a decision. He had closed the file and sworn his staff to secrecy. The reason was in the final paragraph of the memo. I have concluded that Colonel Whitmore's actions, while unauthorized and technically treasonous, served the interests of both the United States and the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister's presence at the invasion would have created intolerable complications. His absence allowed the operation to proceed without political interference. Whitmore understood what needed to be done and did it accepting full personal risk. This is the kind of officer any service would be proud to claim. I recommend that this file be sealed permanently and that no further action be taken. Rawlings had known the truth for months before Whitmore died. He could have exposed the deception at any time. Instead, he chose to protect the man who had manipulated his country's prime minister. He chose to recognize that sometimes the right thing and the legal thing are not the same. This revelation changes our understanding of the entire operation. Whitmore was not just lucky to escape justice. He was protected by the very institution he had deceived. British intelligence had looked at what he had done and decided that it was on balance the correct decision. The Phantom Headquarters was not just an American operation that happened to succeed. It was an operation that earned the grudging respect of even those who should have been its victims. There is a final irony to this story that Whitmore himself would have appreciated. In 1965, 20 years after his death, Winston Churchill passed away at the age of 90. In the days following his death, as the world mourned the loss of one of the 20th century's greatest leaders, historians began the work of compiling his complete biography. Among Churchill's personal papers, they found a note dated June 15, 1944, 9 days after D-Day. The note was addressed to no one. It appeared to be Churchill's private reflection on why he had not observed the invasion from HMS Belfast. "I knew there was something wrong," Churchill wrote. The story about the forward headquarters never quite made sense. Eisenhower's refusal was too convenient. The King's letter was too perfectly timed. Someone was managing me. Someone was keeping me away from the invasion. I let them succeed because I understood eventually that they were right. My presence would have been a complication. The young men on those beaches did not need me watching. They needed me here doing the work that only I could do. So I stayed, and I let whoever orchestrated this deception believe they had fooled me. Perhaps that is my final contribution to the invasion, allowing others to believe they are cleverer than Winston Churchill. The man who saved Western civilization had known all along. He had seen through the Phantom Headquarters. He had understood exactly what Whitmore was doing. And he had chosen to play along because he recognized the wisdom of being managed for the greater good. This is the deepest lesson of the Phantom Headquarters operation. It is not about the cleverness of the deception or the audacity of manipulating a prime minister. It is about the humility of great leaders who know when to step aside. Churchill could have exposed the operation at any time. He could have boarded HMS Belfast despite all efforts to stop him. He was Winston Churchill. No one could truly prevent him from doing anything he was determined to do. But he chose not to. He chose to let a former high school teacher from Ohio manage him for the good of the mission. He chose to subordinate his ego to the greater cause. And in doing so, he demonstrated a kind of greatness that no speech or military decision could ever match. From a high school history teacher with an impossible mission to a deception that kept Winston Churchill away from D-Day. Colonel James Whitmore proved that courage is not just about facing bullets. It is about making impossible choices when no one is watching. It is about carrying secrets that can never be shared. It is about becoming what you despise in order to protect what you love. The Phantom Headquarters saved the D-Day invasion from political complications that might have cost thousands of lives. The techniques Whitmore pioneered have influenced 80 years of intelligence operations and saved millions more. And the moral questions he raised in his final letter continue to haunt everyone who serves in the shadows. If you know another forgotten story of World War II, another moment when ordinary people did extraordinary things, share it in the comments. History is full of phantoms waiting to be discovered. Subscribe to find more of these stories. Because the official records never tell the whole truth. And remember what Colonel James Whitmore understood in that frozen farmhouse where he drew his last breath. The mission always comes first. But the mission is not about winning wars. The mission is about preserving something worth fighting for. Democracy, freedom, the right of ordinary people to live extraordinary lives. That is why he created a phantom. That is why he died in Germany. That is why his story deserves to be remembered, Some heroes wear medals, others carry secrets. The greatest heroes do both and never tell anyone the difference.